Okay, so today's question I'm going to jump right into because it requires a lengthy response, is from an expectant father. And he says, my wife is 7 months pregnant and all anyone can talk about is how to avoid a C-section. I don't get it. Doesn't everyone have a C-section these days? And isn't a healthy baby really the point? Okay, well, that's a great question. A really good question, and it has a couple of components to it that I need to address. Let's start out by delivering a little bit of information that I feel like people don't necessarily know. Unless you're in the sort of birthing community, you're probably not aware of certain statistics and trends and so forth. In terms of trends with cesarean sections, the most you hear about in the media is this trend that came about in the past few years of women scheduling their C-sections basically to suit their needs. Like celebrities who are like, well, I have to go on tour, or my husband's doing this or that, and so I have to get a C-section. Okay, so, I really think that's sort of a small percentage of the population. So what I wanted to talk about, I want to sort of give a bigger framework and then kind of go into answering those questions specifically that this father-to-be has, okay? So the first thing I wanted to point out is that the United States has a really terrible track record as far as maternal mortality and infant mortality. I'm not sure if people know that. We think of the United States as being a highly developed country with great hospitals and medical care and so forth. And all of that is true. We do have, in some senses, the best of everything. But what we're falling behind on is, it falls in the area of birth. And the maternal mortality rate in the United States currently is 37th, I think, 34th out of all industrialized nations. And that kind of puts us at the very bottom of the list. 34th for maternal and 37th for infant. So we're even lower. We have an even lower ranking for infant mortality rate. And so what this means is that babies die during childbirth and women still die during childbirth. And the reason C-section is relevant to that conversation is just because an operation comes with risks and complications and all sorts of things that are not present necessarily with a normal physiological birth. A vaginal birth is basically what I'm saying, in contrast to a C-section. So we have to think about those factors. And I don't want to get off on a tangent of why our maternal and fetal or infant mortality rates are so bad. It really is a combination of things. There are a bunch of reasons why, but C-section absolutely factors into that. So coming back into the argument of cesarean section, doesn't everybody do it, says his father? Well, it would seem that way, doesn't everybody do it? Because the percentage of C-sections in hospitals right now has gone up enormously in the past 30 and 40 years. So if we look at statistics from the early 1970s, we're looking at a 5.5% C-section rate nationally. And that continued to climb. So by the mid-80s, we had a 22.7% C-section rate in the country. And by more recent numbers, like in 2007, we're climbing into the low 30s, okay, 31.8%. And that still doesn't seem that bad. That's 30, if you're thinking 30% of all women who give birth are giving birth via C-section. That's still high, but it doesn't seem that bad. But here's the problem. For one thing, the World Health Organization says that anything higher than 10% is really inexcusable. Higher than 10%. So that means that in this country alone, 20% of those C-sections were unnecessary. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that happens, why that is exactly. But, I also want to say that the C-section rate going up so much is really, I I mean, it's a result of a few different things, and not just this trend for women automatically having a C-section. So let's talk about first what the parameters of a cesarean section are. You know, back in the 70s, when women were only getting, like only 5% of women were having a C-section, it was usually for two general reasons. One was some kind of pre-existing condition that would have made it necessary to deliver by C-section. The other cases would have been some emergency during childbirth. Now, a pre-existing condition for C-section, we have a bunch of them, and frequently women who are considered high risk are the ones who doctors will often say we need to go straight to C-section. But if that's you, you know about that already. It might be a breech presentation, it might be twins, it might be a condition like placenta previa, or different complications with the placenta that won't allow the baby to pass through the cervix, things like that. And sometimes health reasons for the mother, diabetes or preeclampsia, those kind of things. So those are sort of medically indicated reasons for having a C-section. On the other side, you have emergency C-sections, and then you have C-sections that just happen because what they like to say in a hospital is failure to progress. I'll talk about that in a second. So when we think about C-section, and again, I was quoting a national rate, I think what's way more alarming and what you need to pay attention to if you're pregnant and trying to avoid this is the actual C-section rate of the hospital or the practice or both that you're going to be using. Okay, so I know for a fact that there are hospitals in the New York area that have really high C-section rates, not 30%. We're talking 50% and higher. I think there's a hospital in Long Island that has like a 90% C-section rate. So that's really high and really uncalled for. And if you go back to that World Health Organization statistic, more than 10% is considered unnecessary. So when you're interviewing a practice, when you're pregnant and you're like, maybe you don't have an OB already, maybe you'd like to look at an OB's practice, and maybe you'd like to look at a midwifery practice, for example, you need to ask them what their C-section rate is and what their feeling is about it. Typically, with midwives, you're going to see a much lower C-section rate because, well, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, in all fairness, a lot of midwives do not take high-risk pregnancies, so they're sort of cutting that statistic out in the mix because they're having women who are physiologically capable of having having a normal vaginal birth. However, midwives also approach birth in a different way than a doctor approaches birth, and they're definitely more relaxed about it. So when you come to that point of the classic failure to progress, a midwife will generally not say that. That really comes into like more extreme circumstances. The midwife is more inclined to be patient throughout the whole birth process and not feel that you're on the clock. Okay, so a medical practice, you're going to find will have a higher C-section rate, and you have to find out how they feel about it.